Yeah. Good morning. Welcome to the October 2017 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, would you please introduce our agenda for this morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, and good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
For today's meeting, you will hear 7 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order that would enable law enforcement and security personnel to obtain quick access to blocked caller ID information needed to investigate threatening calls. It also would amend the Commission's rules to allow non-public emergency services such as private ambulance companies to obtain blocked caller ID information associated with calls requesting assistance. Second, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking and notice of inquiry that proposes to amend the Commission's rules as well as seeks comment on industry models to move toward complete nationwide number portability to promote competition between all service providers and can increase network routing efficiencies. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment and propose changes to the priority access license rules in the 3.5 gigahertz band to increase incentives for investment, encourage more efficient spectrum use, and promote faster and more widespread network deployments. Fourth, you will consider a report and order on reconsideration on hearing aid compatibility, or HAC, that would update the volume control standard for wireline telephones, extend wireline HAC requirements to cover telephones used with advanced communication services, adopt a volume control rule for wireless handsets, and delete from the Commission's rules an obsolete wireless HAC standard. Fifth, you will consider a report and order that would eliminate the traffic and revenue reports and streamline the circuit capacity reports. Sixth, you will consider a report and order eliminating the rule that requires each AM, FM, and television broadcast station to maintain a main studio located in or near its community of license. Seventh, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks comment on updates to Section 73.624G of the Commission's rules, which imposes certain reporting obligations for broadcasters relating to the provision of ancillary or supplementary services, and Section 73.3580, which requires public notice of the filing of broadcast applications, including from newspapers. This is your agenda for today. The first item, entitled Rules and Policies Regarding Calling Number Identification Service, Caller ID, will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Weber, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Today I am pleased to introduce an item that will make it easier for public safety officials and security personnel to respond to threatening calls with blocked caller ID while maintaining individual privacy protections. In recent years, media and law enforcement reports indicate that the number of threatening calls has been increasing dramatically. Blocked caller ID information can hinder timely investigation of these calls. The report and order before you ensures that law enforcement and the threatened party's security personnel have quicker access to the information they need to thwart threatening callers without the regulatory delay inherent in seeking a waiver of the Commission's rules. The item also includes key protections to prevent bad actors from abusing the exemption. Before turning the presentation over to CGB staff, I would like to thank other bureaus and offices for their assistance: the Office of General Counsel, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. With me at the table this morning are Kurt Schroeder, Chief of CGB's Consumer Policy Division, Nancy Stevenson, Deputy Chief of the Division, and Nellie Fusner, Honors Attorney in the Division. Nellie will present the item.
Great.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Blocked caller ID can hinder investigations of telephone threats like those against Jewish community centers earlier this year and against school districts and NASA before that. The report and order before you amends the Commission's caller ID rules to allow called parties and law enforcement to obtain blocked caller ID information as a way of facilitating their investigation of threatening calls. This is a narrow, tailored exemption from the privacy protections under the Commission's current rules, which recognize that a caller may have a legitimate interest in blocking caller ID. The amended rules would define a threatening call, which triggers the application of the new exemption, as any call that conveys an emergency involving danger of death or serious physical injury to any person requiring disclosure without delay of information relating to the emergency. This definition is consistent with existing federal statutory requirements for emergency disclosures by carriers. The report and order includes protections to prevent bad actors from abusing the exemption. It requires that a request for blocked caller ID associated with a threatening call must be made by law enforcement on behalf of the threatened party. Additionally, the report and order limits the distribution of blocked caller ID information to law enforcement and, as directed by law enforcement, security personnel directly responsible for the safety and security of the threatened party. The new exemption for threatening calls encompasses the pending temporary waiver order for the Jewish community centers. As such, the temporary waiver is no longer necessary for the same information to be obtained. Finally, the report and order also amends the caller ID privacy rules to allow non-public emergency services, such as private ambulance services, to obtain blocked caller ID information of the callers requesting their assistance. We recommend the adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fusner, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, starting with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. 60 years ago, 9 African American students made history when they entered into the doors of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. In the days following September 25th, 1957, it was reported that threatening phone calls were received nightly in the homes of these history-making students. What if caller ID existed then, and the identities of the perpetrators of these threatening phone calls were quickly shared with law enforcement personnel? Maybe, and I recognize and I choose to look through this through a current day lens, it would have made a difference in the lives of those families. Unfortunately, even with advancements in technology, law enforcement personnel continue to face challenges with identifying and thwarting threatening telephone calls. This was evidenced, as you heard earlier this year, by the telephoned bomb threats made against Jewish community centers across this nation. So today the Commission acts on a bipartisan basis to ensure that when a threatening call is made, security and law enforcement personnel can quickly access blocked caller ID information. By aligning our definition of a threatening call with the standards set in the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, we enable a narrowly tailored exemption of our rules. Specifically, we establish that caller ID information can only be provided to law enforcement when such a call conveys an emergency involving danger of death or serious physical injury to any person requiring disclosure without delay of information relating to the emergency. I am grateful for the work of the Consumer and Government Affairs Bureau for responding to the concerns initially raised by Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer and following through with the day's order. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During this proceeding, I've endeavored to strike the appropriate balance between providing information to law enforcement to help them investigate threatening calls while safeguarding the valid privacy interest of callers who may choose to block caller ID to protect themselves or others from harm. I also sought to narrow the circumstances under which loosely defined security personnel could obtain access to caller ID information. I wanted to ensure that providers are not put in an untenable situation of deciding whether there's a real threat or who should receive such information. Additionally, we must protect call recipients from bad actors and others who may claim to be security personnel to get access to the information for their own purposes. Given the Commission's penchant for TV references, let me delve into a couple to highlight that for every legitimate security personnel. There's a James Gardner of the Rockford Files or a Thomas Selleck of Magnum PI seeking to extract information for unintended purposes. The item resolves this to a satisfactory degree, I hope, by tying the security personnel to those approved or authorized by law enforcement. I thank the chairman and the staff for working with me to resolve these concerns, and I will vote to approve. There's a little bit of an echo.
I've noticed that too, but I like the old school references though. Now I've got the theme song of Rockford Files in my brain. So, Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. As we heard this morning, over the past few years, we've seen a significant increase in bomb threats being called into our schools, religious institutions, and community centers. According to one study, the number of bomb threats during the 2015 to 2016 school year doubled from 3 years earlier. More than half of those threats were made by phone. In some cases, the perpetrators have been able to remain anonymous by taking advantage of an FCC rule that allows them to block their caller ID information. Today, we address this problem by adopting an exemption for threatening calls from our caller ID rules. Specifically, as we've heard, we'll allow carriers to disclose the blocked caller ID information associated with threatening calls to law enforcement so they can quickly identify and investigate these threats. I'm grateful the FCC has moved quickly to address this issue. The order has my support, and I want to thank as well the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for your diligent work on this important issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to the Bureau for your hard work on this important issue. No statement. I simply support.
Thank you, Commissioner. I, too, will go submit a fuller statement for the record. Everything that can be said has been said by Ms. Fusner and by my colleagues on the bench. I just want to thank the staff of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, in particular Micah Caldwell, Nellie Fusner, Karen Schroeder, Kurt Schroeder, Richard Smith, Nancy Stevenson, Mark Stone, Christy Thornton, and Patrick Weber. From the Office of General Counsel, Douglas Klein, William Layton, Richard Mallon, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson. From the Wireline Competition Bureau, Kirk Berge, Daniel Kahn, Melissa Kirkle, Nirali Patel, and Ann Stevens. And last but not least, from the Office of Communication Business Opportunities, Belford Lawson. Thank you for aiding the Commission as it's moved with relative light speed from notice of proposed rulemaking all the way to report and order. With that, we will proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks very much for your work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. It is entitled Nationwide Number Portability, Numbering Policies for Modern Communications, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Great. Ms. Monteith, whenever you and your folks are ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking and notice of inquiry on nationwide number portability. This item, if adopted, would seek comment on how best to move toward complete nationwide number portability, paving the way to expanding competition between all service providers, regardless of size or type, and promoting the consumer benefits of keeping your telephone number, whether changing service providers, moving from one neighborhood to another, or relocating across the country. I would like to thank the Competition Policy Division team for their work on this proceeding. Our colleagues in the Wireless Telecommunications, Public Safety and Homeland Security, and Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureaus, and in the Offices of Strategic Planning and General Counsel also provided us with invaluable input. Seated at the table with me from WCB's Competition Policy Division are Daniel Kahn, Division Chief, Ann Stevens, Deputy Division Chief, Heather Hendrickson, Acting Assistant Division Chief, and Sherwin C., Special Counsel. Sherwin will now present the item.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and Notice of Inquiry before you, if adopted, would seek comment on various plans to ensure that consumers can keep their telephone numbers when moving from any provider to any other provider, or from one location to another location nationwide. Currently, the telecommunications system lacks this ability, creating a competitive disadvantage for many smaller, regional, and rural providers, as well as generating confusion and frustration for consumers when they want to keep their telephone number when changing their physical location. If adopted, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking would seek comment on the first steps we could take to amend our rules to encourage and accommodate nationwide number portability. Specifically, in the NPRM, we seek to do four things. First, we propose to eliminate the N-1 number portability database query requirement. Second, we propose extending to competitive local exchange carriers our forbearance from the inter-exchange dialing parity requirements. Third, we seek comment on further extending this forbearance from inter-exchange dialing parity rules to so-called grandfathered accounts. And fourth, we propose eliminating rules that only serve to implement the requirements from which we are forbearing. We believe that these rules have outlived their original purposes in many cases, and that their continued presence could act as barriers to nationwide number portability efforts by requiring certain routing and query practices that would introduce inefficiencies in a nationwide number portability system. The notice of inquiry, if adopted, would seek comment on a set of proposed mechanisms for achieving nationwide number portability that have been described and evaluated by various industry groups, stakeholders, and the North American Numbering Council, the Commission's Federal Advisory Committee on Numbering Resources. In the notice, we ask interested parties to comment on the benefits and drawbacks of these proposals, as well as to identify which ones can best and most readily move the country to a system that allows nationwide number portability. The Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of inquiry and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. C., rocking the presentation and the pocket square at once. Very, very much appreciated. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
True. Number portability may not grab front page headlines, but its implications for consumer choice and competition are significant. Nearly 2 years ago, the Commission requested that the North American Numbering Council, or NANCY, evaluate and recommend actions to enable nationwide number portability. In May of 2016, NANCY answered with a far-ranging report identifying paths forward and likely barriers that the Commission would need to consider along the way. Today, we move towards making nationwide number portability a reality by opening a proceeding to examine exactly whether and how we should implement it. I look forward to reviewing the record and evaluating what next steps we as a Commission should take. I am particularly interested in hearing from consumers on how this will impact their ability to move freely from one carrier to another, as well as from carriers, as to how this will impact their ability to compete in the marketplace. While I am tempted to use this opportunity to make an incredibly relevant yet incredibly inappropriate reference to a rap song about gardening implements and numbering resources, my better angels hold me back, and my mother. Instead, I will thank the Wireline Competition Bureau and the numbering team in particular for your hard work on this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. You can go for it. What happens with the FCC stays with the FCC.
Yes, that's what I've heard.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Yeah.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
I'm going to submit my statement for the record. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Sticking with the theme of older pop culture references, in 1937, you may not know this, but the Pulitzer Prize for Drama went to the Broadway play You Can't Take It With You. And 80 years later, this phrase is unfortunately all too applicable to consumers in the number portability context. Consumers can take their phone numbers with them when they switch providers or move relatively locally, but our rules generally prevent consumers who are moving to a new state or in some cases to a neighboring county or city from doing the same. This is not only an annoyance for consumers, but it can hurt competition when small and regional service providers can't offer new customers the ability to keep their phone number. Accordingly, I'm glad the Commission is initiating this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and NOI to examine ways to encourage nationwide number portability. I'd like to thank my colleagues as well for incorporating into the notice some questions I have about the proposed routing changes and how they might impact 911 or next generation 911 calls. It's not clear to me at this point that there's going to be an impact, but this is a question that I'm glad stakeholders will now be able to address in their comments. I support this item and look forward to reviewing the record as it develops.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I've got no references to gardening, rap music, or 1930s pop culture. I will just say that I support this without a statement. Thank you to the Bureau for your work.
I, too, do not have a 1937 reference. I'm going to go far more modern, 1981, when Tommy Tutone, as you remember, sang and begged, "Jenny, don't change your number, 867-5309. Now, unfortunately for Tommy, if Jenny today wanted to switch her service to another carrier, to a smaller non-nationwide carrier in particular, she very well might not be able to change her phone number. But today, thanks to the work of the staff, we have begun considering ways to change that. We propose removing outdated rules that may impede so-called nationwide number portability, and we start to explore how to support greater choice by letting a consumer keep her number no matter which carrier she chooses. And this will help everyone benefit from competition. Thanks to the dedicated staff arrayed in front of us for their efforts, Bill Anderle, Ken Carlberg, Terry Kavanaugh, Alex Espinoza, Heather Hendrickson, Dan Kahn, Rick Mallon, Timothy May, Chris Monteith, Claudio Pavo, Sherwin C., Jerome Stanshine, and Ann Stevens. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner Riley.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, please announce the next item on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Office of Engineering and Technology. It is entitled Promoting Investment in the 3550 to 3700 megahertz band, and Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau is pleased to present a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and Order addressing fixed and mobile services in the 3550 to 3700 megahertz band. The item proposes certain rule changes that are intended to promote investment in the band, encourage efficient spectrum use, and facilitate rapid and widespread deployment of next-generation wireless services. I am joined at the table by Neshe Gendelsberger and Jessica Griffenius, along with Julia Snap and Bob Pavlik of the Office of Engineering and Technology. In addition to the staff seated at the table, I would like to thank the team and WTB's Mobility Division for their hard work on this item, as well as staff from the Office of Engineering and Technology, the International Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel listed on the slide for providing their valuable expertise. Jessica will present the item.
Thanks.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
We present today a notice of proposed rulemaking and order that aim to promote deployment of next-generation networks in the 3.5 gigahertz band. The targeted changes proposed in the notice are intended to foster an investment environment for the band, as a number of nations target these frequencies for 5G deployments and next-generation technologies. The notice proposes and seeks comment on several changes to the rules governing priority access licenses, or PALs, including longer license terms, larger geographic license areas, and the ability to renew PALs and to partition and disaggregate them. These proposed changes are consistent with the service rules and licensing models that helped foster the development of 4G and LTE services in the United States. We anticipate that adopting similar rules for the 3.5 gigahertz band likewise will encourage robust investment in network deployment across a full range of technologies and facilitate flexible access to the band by a wider range of users. The notice also seeks comment on changes to the technical rules that could facilitate operation over wider bandwidths while ensuring that current and future incumbent operations continue to be protected from interference. Additionally, the notice seeks comment on changes to information security requirements that would help safeguard private information and protect critical infrastructure. The accompanying order would deny two specific proposals. First, to allow PAL use in the entire 150 megahertz of the band, and second, to increase power limits for base stations. Revisiting these issues would upset the balance the Commission previously struck in establishing the spectrum sharing framework in this band. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology recommend adoption of the item and request editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griffenius. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Nearly 5 years ago, this commission embarked on a process to explore the viability of using 3.5 gigahertz band for commercial wireless broadband services. Each step along the way, I have voiced my support for using this ban on a shared basis because of the tremendous opportunities it presents for new entrants and smaller providers. So yes, I would have preferred that the majority not launch this NPRM because it sets the Commission down a path to undo rule provisions for the ban that already are fueling investment in innovative services which promise to bring broadband to unserved areas and more competition to the commercial wireless market. In 2015, the rules we adopted for the Priority Access Licenses, or PALs, were designed not just to benefit commercial wireless companies, but attract investment and innovation from manufacturers, utilities, hotels, office complexes, shopping malls, commercial real estate companies, and universities. These are entities that want to build wireless networks that require some measure of interference protection, yet they are not appropriately outsourced to a commercial cellular network. Instead of designing traditional wireless licenses with large geographic areas, 10-year license terms, and the expectations of renewal, we took a more creative regulatory approach, recognizing that the Internet of Things and 5G services would require the use of small cells that serve more targeted areas. The Commission properly determined that a census tract was the more appropriate license size for PALs, with a shorter license term and no expectation of renewability. Those characteristics also make the PALs affordable for small school systems and rural hospitals located in underserved areas that are desperate for cost-effective broadband services. The overwhelming evidence demonstrates that those rules are working. Wireless Internet service providers, or WISP, that tend to serve rural areas, equipment manufacturers, tech companies, and heavy industries have raced to invest millions of dollars to unlock the potential of mid-band spectrum in the Citizens Broadband Radio Service Band. To date, 55 entities, including chip makers, mobile carriers, cable companies, equipment manufacturers, and more, have joined the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, Alliance. 47 companies participating in the Wireless Innovation Forum have spent thousands of hours developing technical standards to implement CBRS. At least a dozen firms have obtained experimental authorizations to trial equipment and technology in the band. They are developing private networks to support an open architecture operating system for the industrial internet, as well as smart grid, rural broadband, small cell backhaul, and other point-to-multipoint networks. So why, despite my support for the 2015 rules for PALs and the clear evidence that they are working, am I voting to concur with this NPRM? The reason is that I negotiated with my majority colleagues to improve the discussion about the geographic size of the PALs. The initial draft, publicly released earlier this month, proposed to increase the geographic size of the license area for PALs. But my colleagues agreed to back away from proposing to increase the geographic size of the PALs and just seek comment on that idea. At my request, the NPRM now includes language asking about offering in urban and rural areas a mix of larger PALs and PALs at the census tract levels. These changes improve the possibility that the Commission will continue to offer PALs at the census tract size. They improve the possibility that a rural wireless broadband service provider, the smallest of school systems, the most budget-constrained small town or single hospital system, that they each have a fair shot to obtain a PAL. And they improve the possibility that the utility companies and large companies who are working on private wireless networks will be able to bring the most innovative Internet of Things, big data analytics, and other 5G solutions to market. The current posture of the NPRM is better for consumers and competition, and it would not have happened unless I voted to concur. So today, I concur and thank Don Stockdale and his staff and the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, in case there was a question as to which bureau I was thanking for Mr. Stockdale, and Julie Knapp, who is always so pleasant. Not that you're not pleasant, Doc. I'm just going down and down. Everybody is pleasant, I think, for their work on this proceeding and their ongoing efforts to unleash the next generation of wireless innovation. Thank you for being so pleasant.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a longer statement, so I apologize to my colleagues in advance. I am pleased to support today's notice that formally initiates a review of the Priority Access License, or PAL, rules for the 3.5 gigahertz band. When the Commission first considered the rules implementing the three-tiered structure of protected incumbents, PALs, and general authorized access, GAA, it was readily apparent that the PAL structure was seriously flawed. In fact, I likened it to a three-legged stool with a broken leg. Therefore, I am looking to fix the previous Commission's missteps. From the beginning, I have expressed concerns, as have many stakeholders, that the short license terms and lack of renewability would hamper investment in PALs. The record in response to petitions received showed that many entities looking at large-scale deployments require certainty that their investment will not be stranded. And the Commission's short-sighted decision to potentially limit the number of PALs available at auction heightened these concerns. If an entity seeks the priority and protection PALs offer, then they should be able to obtain this spectrum, even if they are the only interested party in the market. So today, the Commission proposes to reverse these poor decisions. The Commission is also seeking comment on increasing the size of the PAL geographic area. I'd like to address some of the misinformation that seems to surround this proceeding. Regardless of the outrage and hyperbole found in some ex parte letters and press articles, the item does not tentatively conclude that PALs will be auctioned exclusively by partial economic areas. Instead, we are seeking comment on a myriad of options. I'm personally supportive of increasing the market sizes from census tracts, which will reduce auction complexity, administrative burdens, and interference concerns. But I also recognize there's many differing views, so I look forward to hearing from all interested parties on this issue. Here is an issue where good old-fashioned compromise and cooperation and negotiation occurred with my friend from South Carolina. While I would have preferred that we keep the NPRM's proposed text, our staffs worked together to find and agree to language on an acceptable compromise that most parties can live with. Generally, the role of the Commission in executing spectrum policy is to ensure that investment and innovation is promoted, that flexible use is permitted, and that the spectrum is attractive to as many users as possible. If the Commission succeeds in this task, the marketplace, through our auction process, will determine the best use of this spectrum. Today's NPRM puts us on this path. While investment in the PALs has always been a concern, it has been amplified because of the emergence of this band as a focal point for future 5G networks. Internationally, many countries are looking in the 3.5 to the 3.5 gigahertz band for the next generation service that will be fully licensed. If we were to go back in time, I may have preferred that approach, but I recognize the work and investment that has gone into GAA and the databases. In fact, today's item preserves GAA and does not seek any modification to those rules. Opponents have stated that the proposed changes are intended to turn this into a 5G-only band for large nationwide providers. That is ridiculous. The Commission implements flexible use policies, meaning a winner at auction can deploy whatever service or innovation they choose. The Commission does not and should not make any decisions regarding what can and cannot be deployed in a band beyond setting technical rules to prevent harmful interference to incumbents and adjacent users. I fervently believe that this spectrum should be available to all purposes, and yes, that includes 5G. What the Commission won't do here is adopt artificial restrictions through license and auction structure to dissuade some users or users some users while promoting others. Such preferences are not in the public interest. In the same vein, I was alarmed that some are under the impression that these licenses were promised to rural providers and other potential users, in part because of a sentiment that big providers warehouse spectrum in smaller markets. Both concepts are wrong. First, the Commission should never promise or provide handouts to any class of entities that may be favored at the time. I don't know if it was actually that explicit or not, but it is a categorical mistake to have allowed the perception that that was the case. Second, while I don't believe that licenses are warehousing spectrum to the extent that the licensees are warehousing spectrum to the extent that we need to fix wireless licenses to ensure broadband build-out in rural markets, the solution is stricter construction obligations going forward and facilitating the partition of licenses. I've also heard that the proposed changes are just a relic of past policies. I disagree again. We have wireless networks that are the envy of the world because our true and tried auction procedures and rules promote investment. Travel internationally as I do, and you'll get repeated questions on how other countries can duplicate the FCC's auction rules. These are the very things, including renewability and longer license terms, that has made the U.S. the leader in wireless technologies. Some opponents say that these changes are not necessary, citing the work and investment that has already occurred under the current rules. However, many of the entities that have invested in the research and development stage of this band are the same ones seeking rule changes or would benefit from having PAL certainty. Similarly, many of these entities are also interested in GAA, so they were going to be active in the process to create the databases, standards, and equipment. However, for large-scale investments in PALs, they expressed that changes would have to be made. Other opponents have argued that the Commission should not review these rules at all. They seem to argue that once the rules are set, there can be no further modifications. The Commission, however, often repurposes spectrum and changes licensing and technical rules when necessary. While the Commission doesn't take such changes lightly, we are still in the initial stage of this band's deployment. If tweaks need to be made, this is the ideal time to do it. It is better than going through years of proceedings after the fact, like the WCS. I've also heard that our auction today will delay putting the spectrum to use. Again, ridiculous. Equipment is being developed, trials are being conducted, and work on the databases continue. This review will occur parallel to the completion of those tasks. While we may not make my initial goal of completing this proceeding by December, early next year is doable, in fact, and the timing should work well with other efforts on the ESCs and the SASs that are underway. Finally, some opponents seem to be engaging in revisionist history by stating that the Commission's decisions on the 3.5 gigahertz band were unanimous. Although, I think it's fair to say that all commissioners unanimously agreed to bringing new spectrum to the marketplace was beneficial and that reasonable protection mechanisms for incumbents were needed, that is where the consensus ended. I clearly expressed when I concurred in the part of the initial order about the PAL structure, knowing that it would have to be revisited in the future. Further, I dissented to these very issues on reconsideration. That is not unanimity. As we go forward, I will keep an open mind. I will look at the substance of the arguments made, not overbroad statements or some artificial tally about how many comments were filed saying X, Y, or Z. I would like to thank the chairman for asking me to head up this review, Commissioner Clyburn for her willingness to work with us in the spirit of compromise to get the document in a good place for her, and the staff for the speedy and good work as they have done so far on this issue to date. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. We've come a long way since 2012 when the Commission first sought comment on creative ways that we could open up the 3.5 gigahertz band. A broad cross-section of stakeholders now view this 150 megahertz block of spectrum as playing a key role in 5G and other next-generation deployments. From my perspective, the 3.5 gigahertz band is about creating something different. We have licensing regimes that favor traditional exclusive use deployments on the one hand, and we also have unlicensed bands where Wi-Fi and other technologies have flourished. We need a new tool in the spectrum toolkit. The 3.5 gigahertz band presents us with that opportunity. So it's incumbent on the Commission to ensure that our rules are going to support and incentivize a wide variety of use cases and deployments. Today's notice of proposed rulemaking does that by asking whether our licensing, auction, and technical rules have struck the right balance, or whether we need to adopt some targeted changes. This notice has my support, and I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops. And I also want to take a moment just to thank the staffs of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering Technology, for the work that you've put in over the years with the goal of making this 3.5 gigahertz theory a reality. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
It is hard to overstate the audacity of United States spectrum policy. Over history, we have done the kooky and the unconventional. We have seen the future and done it differently before anyone else. In the process, we have changed the way that wireless systems are developed and distributed, not just domestically, but worldwide. After all, it's more than 2 decades ago we took the academic ideas of Ronald Coase and reimagined how we distribute our airwaves. Instead of doling out specific licenses for specific uses based on political cues, we ushered in a new era of spectrum auctions, selling access to bidders and allowing them to use it however they choose. It's difficult to remember now, but there was a time when those ideas were mocked by experts, opposed by industry, and dismissed by policymakers. However, in the rearview mirror, they have been a resounding success. The Commission has held more than 85 auctions, issued more than 44,000 licenses, and raised more than $140 billion in revenue. As a result, our efforts have become a model for regulators worldwide. We also pioneered the use of unlicensed spectrum. We took a handful of underused frequencies known as garbage bands in the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz bands and decided to test a new model. Instead of dismissing these airwaves as junk, we put in place technical parameters and then did something radical. We gave the public access to these airwaves. This was edgy stuff. It was a move away from command and control spectrum policy, but this experiment was a wild success because in time a standard was developed known as 802.11, and this is the spectrum where Wi-Fi was born. More recently, we blazed a trail for incentive auctions. The two-sided broadcast incentive auction that the Commission just held was the first of its kind worldwide. We tested the proposition that existing licensees might voluntarily relinquish their rights in exchange for a portion of the proceeds from the subsequent re-auction of their airwaves for new flexible use. And so far, so good. The auction concluded successfully earlier this year, and regulators globally are taking note. That same audacity fueled our initial plans for the 3.5 gigahertz band. But I fear that with today's rulemaking, this agency has lost its daring. Instead of continuing in the innovative spirit of United States spectrum policy, we are in retreat. We are slowing access to these airwaves and falling back on stale spectrum policy ideas that may have worked in the past, but will by no means guarantee our success in the future. The 3.5 gigahertz band the Commission put in place 2 years ago was creative. Instead of relying on the traditional binary choice between licensed and unlicensed, the agency adopted an unprecedented 3-tiered model for spectrum sharing and management. Under this 3-tiered system, incumbent government users have a primary and preemptive right, but they do not need access all the time, everywhere. So we created a secondary license opportunity custom built for small cells. Then, to the extent that demand for licenses is limited, opportunistic use is permitted by rule. Now, to coordinate this grand effort, we proposed dynamic spectrum access systems. Clearly, elements of this 3.5 gigahertz model remain in place, but this rulemaking seeks to gut what was most visionary about this framework. It seeks comment on extended license terms. It asks about putting in place larger geographic licenses and it offers up same old instead of what could be creative and different. To put a finer point on it, this rulemaking takes what was most innovative about our existing 3.5 gigahertz model and casts it aside in favor of existing business models. This is short-sighted. The success of our future auctions depends on growing a new class of spectrum interests who can innovate and join the ranks of those who bid on airwaves and support the Internet of Things. This is important because as our national providers grow bigger and fewer in number, the power of using auctions as a tool for distribution is compromised. Simply put, we need more entities interested in opportunities in our airwaves. Moreover, our 3.5 gigahertz band was ready to go. Millions of dollars have been invested. More than 200 experimental authorizations have been granted. Protocols regarding operations, interoperability, security, and device testing are already underway. Product certification programs have begun. All of that, however, stops short with this rulemaking. We can hem and haw about how we are making changes to foster deployment, to increase investment, and speed the way to 5G. I don't buy it. We are impeding real progress. We are betraying our hard-won spectrum tradition of leading the pack and changing the paradigm. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Shortly after becoming chairman, I asked Commissioner O'Reilly to take the lead in examining whether the Commission's 3.5 gigahertz rules struck the right balance for encouraging investment and innovation in the band. Today's notice is the direct result of his efforts. I am grateful to Commissioner O'Reilly for his outstanding leadership on this issue, and am pleased to support this notice. Thanks to the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of General Counsel for their work on the item. We will now proceed to a vote, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
I concur.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff again for the work. And Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item on your agenda will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau and is entitled Access to Telecommunications Equipment and Services by Persons with Disabilities, amendment of the Commission's rules governing hearing aid compatible mobile handsets, and comment sought on 2010 review of hearing aid compatibility regulations. Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Weber, back to you.
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Today, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau presents to you a report and order on reconsideration, ensuring that wireline and wireless phones are equipped with volume control suitable for people with hearing loss and enabling access to voice over IP devices. The rules promise to make these devices and the services with which they are used more accessible to the 48 million Americans with hearing loss, both those who wear hearing aids and those who do not. This will especially benefit members of our growing senior citizen population and ensure that more individuals with hearing loss can communicate by phone directly, reducing the need for more costly and indirect forms of communications, such as third-party telecommunications relay services. Joining me at the table today are Karen Pelt-Strauss, Deputy Chief of CGB, Bob Aldrich, CGB Front Office Legal Advisor, Susie Rosen-Singleton, Chief of our Disability Rights Office, and Sue Barr, Attorney Advisor in the Disability Rights Office. In addition, I would like to thank the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the Office of General Counsel for their contributions to this item. Sue will now present the item.
Great.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present this report and order on reconsideration concerning hearing aid compatibility. The item has four main parts. First, the item expands the hearing aid compatibility rules for wireline telephones to cover devices used with advanced communication services, including voice over Internet protocol telephones, consistent with the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. Second, The item adopts a requirement for wireless phones to provide volume control suitable for people with hearing loss, subject to a 3-year compliance deadline. This requirement will apply only to wireless handsets that are certified as compliant with the Commission's existing hearing aid compatibility requirements. Third, the item adopts a new industry standard for measuring volume control on wireline phones, which was developed by a TIA standard setting group. The new standard provides a more reliable test of the sound level achieved at the maximum volume control setting and uses metrics that make it easier for consumers to select phones that can meet their individual hearing needs. Fourth, the item eliminates from the rules an outdated industry standard for radio frequency interference reduction and magnetic coupling with wireless phones. We believe the rules adopted in this item will further assist millions of Americans with hearing loss to find and use phones that are accessible to them. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barr. We'll now proceed to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
I had the privilege some 7 years ago of watching then-President Barack Obama, with the legendary Stevie Wonder by his side, sign into law the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, or CVAA. I count that moment as one of the highlights of my FCC career because it aptly codified this agency's mission in the 21st century, that regardless of circumstance or ability, every American is as deserving of access to emerging advanced technologies as the other. In today's order, we move a step closer to that goal by requiring the industry to develop a standard for volume control that meets the needs of those with hearing loss. This report and order will give those that wear hearing aids greater ability to control the volume of the sounds they hear when using a wide range of phones, from basic wireline phones to wireless phones and phones with VoIP and other advanced services. Volume control is something most of us take for granted, and given how important it is for me to sometimes have to lower the volume on my phone these days, I'm not sure what that means. I'll talk to you guys later about what that means. I am pleased to be able to finally say to those who have struggled with volume controls for far too long that we are listening and moving forward. The CVAA and today's order are both possible because the commercial mobile industry, equipment manufacturers, and accessibility advocates realize that making real progress on behalf of the 54 million Americans with hearing loss was more important than getting bogged down in litigation. There are a number of communications policy issues and players that could benefit from taking note of just how much progress we were able to make in just over 7 years by collaborating on accessibility issues. I want to thank Patrick Weber and his staff in the Consumer and Government Affairs Bureau for their presentations and the excellent work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I'll put my full statement in the record, but I just have a couple comments. I generally support most of the provisions within the item today, but I disagree with the portions that mandate wireless volume control. I appreciate Commissioner Carr's engagement to seek comment on a newly developed standard and refresh the record on this topic. In fact, one survey shows that 27 to 29% of the people are dissatisfied. 50% of the hearing impaired respondents were satisfied or very satisfied with the volume on their cell phones. But in regulating, we rely solely on the 29% who are dissatisfied in this one 2014 survey. We don't have any more information or current than that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. 2 weeks ago, I had the chance to speak at an ITU conference in Argentina about the FCC's efforts to promote accessibility in communications. It was heartening to hear the global consensus in favor of ensuring that every person in every community has access to advanced communications. And it was clear from the discussion that the United States and the FCC have been playing a lead role in this endeavor. Today's decision is part of that effort. In the order, we adopt an updated volume control standard for wireline phones, which will more accurately account for the way consumers with hearing loss use these devices. We also eliminate outdated and unnecessary standards that no longer reflect the most accurate testing method for wireless handsets. But unfortunately, I can't support every part of today's decision. In particular, I have concerns with the portion of the order that adopts a volume control requirement for wireless devices. While I appreciate the importance of volume control standards for the hearing loss community, as well as my colleagues' interest in addressing this issue, the order does not adequately justify imposing this requirement. For instance, the order's cost-benefit analysis does not account for all the costs associated with this new requirement. Now, this might be because the relevant technical standard is still undergoing development. But in my view, this uncertainty means that we should seek additional comment rather than proceeding directly to a rule. Indeed, the order seems to acknowledge this point, at least implicitly, because it provides for a 3-year implementation schedule in an effort to account for the additional standard-setting work that is yet to be done. And the order states the Commission will likely need to initiate another rulemaking after that standard is set. Given this built-in delay and the order's acknowledgement that key pieces of the requirement are still in flux, I think the better course would have been to move this entire discussion to a further notice of proposed rulemaking. And in my view, I would have preferred for the Commission to steer much more clear of the standard-setting process, given the ongoing efforts that private sector stakeholders are currently engaged in. In light of these concerns, I'll be voting to approve in part and dissent in part. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to the Bureau and the Disability Rights Office for this important item on volume control. Thank you to my colleagues for also working through some last-minute changes. It has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ensuring that all Americans have access to communication services is a top priority for this Commission. Ensuring that all Americans with disabilities have access to communications services is a top priority for me, and that is why I'm pleased to support this item. Approximately 13% of all Americans, or over 38 million people, are deaf or hard of hearing. According to a new study from Johns Hopkins University, the number of Americans aged 20 and older who suffer from hearing loss is expected to nearly double over the next 4 decades. Now, our decision here tackles that trend head on. It improves the measurement of volume control in wireline phones. It extends the hearing aid compatibility requirements for wireline phones to consumer equipment for advanced communication services. And it includes a volume control requirement for wireless phones. Given that a significant percentage of respondents in a recent survey have reported dissatisfaction with handset volume controls, our hope is that this order will go a long way to addressing a glaring problem. Like my colleagues, I want to thank the staff that contributed to today's item, to Bob Aldrich, to Sue Barr, to Susie Rosen-Singleton, to Karen Peltz-Strauss, and Patrick Weber from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, to David Horowitz, Bill Richardson, and Anjali Singh from the Office of General Counsel, to Sorb Chabra, Eli Johnson, Michael Rowan, and Peter Trachtenberg from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Pamela Hairston, Jeremy Marcus, and Daniel Meyerson from the Enforcement Bureau. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Approve in part and dissent in part.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks, folks, for your work. Madam Secretary, can you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, the 5th item on your agenda will be presented by the International Bureau and is entitled Providers of International Services, 2016 Biennial Review of Telecommunications Regulations. Tom Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Good morning. The International Bureau is pleased to present a report and order that will implement reforms to the international reporting requirements as proposed by the Commission earlier this year. That proposal and today's item reflect changing circumstances in international markets and reduce the regulatory burden on our licensees accordingly. In reaching its recommendations, I am proud to report the Bureau undertook a thorough review of the costs and benefits of the reporting requirements. Adoption of this item will minimize costs while allowing the Commission to fulfill its statutory obligations, including those related to consumer protection, national security, and public safety. I would like to thank our OGC and public safety colleagues for their collaboration on the item. I would also like to specifically thank Jerry Ellig, the FCC's chief economist, for his input and collaboration on the item. With me at the table are Jim Schlichting, Senior Deputy Bureau Chief, Walt Strack, Chief Economist, Denise Coca, Chief of the Division, David Kretsch, Associate Chief, and Kim Cook, Attorney Advisor. Kim will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Good morning. The current rules require international service providers to file annual traffic and revenue reports for international voice services, international miscellaneous services, and international common carrier private lines. The rules also require providers of international telecommunication services to file annual circuit capacity reports identifying their submarine cable, satellite, and terrestrial capacity between the United States and foreign points. The Bureau's cost-benefit analysis found that the annual traffic and revenue reporting requirements impose significant costs on both industry and the Commission. Moreover, since the Commission began collecting the traffic and revenue data, competition has led to dramatic declines in the settlement rates on most U.S. international routes, with average settlement rates decreasing from 18 cents per minute in 2000 to 3 cents in 2014, an 83% drop. During that time, the average revenue per minute, a general measure of international calling prices, has decreased from 47 cents per minute to 4 cents. Given the competitive nature of the international markets, the report and order concludes that the traffic and revenue reports are no longer necessary, as the costs of the data collection now exceed the benefits. If issues arise regarding particular international routes, the Commission can instead rely on targeted data collections on an as-needed basis in combination with third-party commercial data sources to obtain the information needed to meet its statutory objectives. This approach will impose fewer costs on both international service providers and the Commission. To minimize the burdens implementing this approach, the item would require each facilities-based international service provider to complete a confidential one-time filing, updated as appropriate, listing the routes on which it has termination arrangements with a carrier in the destination foreign country. The report and order finds it is in the public interest to retain the circuit capacity reports, with some modifications to streamline and reduce the burdens on providers. It concludes that the benefits of the reports justify the costs. The data from the reports are necessary for the Commission to fulfill its statutory obligations, including those related to national security and public safety, and will continue to play a vital public interest role for other federal agencies. To streamline this reporting requirement, the report and order eliminates the requirement that carriers file circuit data for terrestrial and satellite facilities. Taken together, these actions significantly reduce burdens to international service providers and the Commission while maintaining data collections necessary for the Commission to fulfill its statutory obligations. The International Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cook, the true star of the Chicago Law class of 1997, and my classmate. We will now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
With this report in order, the Commission takes another critical step in ensuring that our reporting requirements better reflect the current state of the international telecommunications market. The increasing demand for wired and wireless services includes both international and domestic communications, and the American consumer expects the same degree of diversity when it comes to communications options when they contact family, friends, and colleagues in Africa or Asia as they have here at home. This demand for choice when it comes to platforms, networks, and service providers creates incredible challenges for communications companies, both large and small. To effectively compete, they must manage cost and invest in infrastructure to meet increased demands on the networks as they align their business models to bring about more innovation to the market. The Commission plays a key role in all of this by fostering innovation and removing unnecessary regulation and filing requirements when it is warranted. By eliminating the traffic revenue report and streamlining the circuit capacity reporting requirement, this order enables companies to spend less time and money dealing with obsolete or overly burdensome requirements and devote more resources towards bringing higher quality international communication services to consumers. I commend Tom Sullivan for his leadership and the International Bureau staff for their hard work throughout these Part 43 reform proceedings. I support the item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my longer statement and just say I really appreciate the effort of the Bureau to scrub its rules and requirements to see if we can't reduce them. I would have liked to have gone further in some places, but there's reasons why we can't. So I thank the item, and we'll go from there.
Patience, young grasshopper. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. This item is another in the FCC's welcome efforts to remove unnecessary reporting obligations. According to one provider, it takes at least a dozen employees more than 600 hours over the course of 4 months to compile the information required for these international traffic and revenue reports. And yet, the Commission no longer needs to collect this data because of increased competition and the ability to obtain the information through other, much less burdensome means. So rather than waste time and personnel on this pointless paperwork, carriers should be able to use those resources to develop new products, upgrade equipment, and better serve customers. I therefore support today's decision to do away with our international traffic and revenue reports. And while we don't eliminate the circuit capacity reports because they're critical to our national security and public safety responsibilities, I also support the modest steps we take to streamline those reporting requirements. And finally, it's worth noting that our action today stems from recommendations the Commission received during the biennial review process. And I think the FCC's willingness to take up these recommendations and move quickly shows the agency's renewed interest in using that process to identify regulations that are in need of reform. For my part, I certainly welcome the input from all stakeholders, whether it's as part of that process or outside of it, on additional ways that we can eliminate or streamline unnecessary regulations. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to the International Bureau for your efforts to eliminate these unnecessary traffic and revenue reports. No statement. It has my support.
Great. Well, in 1941, Washington National Airport, now Reagan National, opened for business. On opening day, American Airlines and Eastern Airlines, the only two airlines operating flights to National, drew straws to determine which would be allowed to land first at the airport. American won. Today at Reagan, you can choose among 10 airlines with direct flights to 85 cities. And among gastronomic delights, you can even choose among such things as Chick-fil-A and Wow Bao. Clearly, times have changed at that airport, and so too in our world. Earlier this year, we identified international reporting requirements as old as National Airport that are due for a change. Well, today we make that change, limiting the annual traffic and revenue reports that were first put in place back in 1941. The record shows that the benefits of this ongoing data collection are scant, while the burdens on providers of international services are anything but. We also streamline our data collection for the circuit capacity reports to require only the information that we actually need. And by relying on targeted data collections instead of retaining these two reports in their current form, we will save filers and our own staff considerable resources without any negative impact on the FCC's mission. Like my colleagues, I want to thank the staff for undertaking a significant cost-benefit analysis in support of this order. Thanks to the staff in IB, the International Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, and to, as Mr. Sullivan pointed out, our Chief Economist, Jerry Ellig, for the terrific work on this item. We'll now proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff and Madam Secretary. Could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the sixth item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Elimination of the Main Studio Rule. And Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Yeah, Ms. Carey, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Media Bureau presents a report and order that will reduce costs and regulatory burdens for broadcasters by eliminating the main studio rule, which requires each AM, FM, and television broadcast station to have a main studio located in or near its local community. Joining me at the table is Diana Sokolow and Raylan Remy of the Media Bureau, and Diana will present the item.
Great.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I am pleased to present this report and order adopting the proposal to eliminate the main studio rule. The order also will eliminate existing requirements associated with the main studio rule, including the requirement that the main studio have full-time management and staff present during normal business hours and be able to originate programming. The Commission first adopted main studio requirements nearly 80 years ago to facilitate input from community members and stations' participation in community activities. As discussed in the order, we conclude that a local studio is no longer needed to fulfill those purposes. Broadcast stations' transition to the online public file is nearing completion, and as a result, the need for community members to visit a station's local main studio to access its public file is quickly becoming a relic of the past. In addition, broadcast stations today rarely interact with their local communities through in-person visits. Instead, such interactions occur via phone calls or online, such as through social media and by email, and technology enables stations to produce local news even without a studio nearby. Eliminating the main studio rule will produce substantial benefits. Broadcasters have stated that their main studio-related costs range from $20,000 per year to several $100,000 per year or more. The money that broadcasters save because of the elimination of the main studio rule could be put towards programming, equipment upgrades, news gathering, and other services that will benefit consumers. Eliminating the main studio rule will also make it easier to launch new broadcast stations in rural areas and to prevent struggling stations in small towns from going dark. The order retains the current rule that requires each AM, FM, television, and Class A television broadcast station to maintain a local or toll-free telephone number. The order also generally requires stations to maintain any portion of the public file that is not part of the online public file at a publicly accessible location within the station's community of license. These requirements will ensure that community members retain the ability to communicate with and obtain information regarding their local stations. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sokolow. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
Today is a solemn one in the history of television and radio broadcasting. By eliminating the main studio rule in its entirety for all broadcast stations, regardless of size or location, the FCC signals that it no longer believes those awarded a license to use the public airwaves should have a local presence in their community. Yes, the very same majority that talks about embracing policies to promote job creation is paving the way for broadcast station groups, large and small, to terminate studio staff and abandon the communities they are obligated to serve. Now, I was willing to keep an open mind when the chairman teed up a proposed rulemaking earlier this year, just in case I was missing some obvious benefits to consumers and struggling broadcasters. Well, the comment period has come and gone, and I am left scratching my head because I cannot reconcile the report and order's rhetoric with today's action. Why would an industry that repeatedly extols the virtues of its local roots want to eliminate the only real connection to that very same community? This past July, I received an email from Don that made me pause. Please vote to keep the main studio rule, he wrote. As an old radio man and former owner of a small market station, it is so disturbing to see what is happening to radio. Then just yesterday, Newsmax CEO Christopher Ruddy, in a Washington Post op-ed, suggested that if this rule is eliminated, local news production could be moved to places like New York and Washington as the big networks buy up local stations. I agree with both statements, in part because most of the benefits cited for eliminating this rule will flow to broadcast station groups that are already experiencing record revenue returns. Changes in the communications landscape over time are inevitable, and most of them we wholeheartedly embrace. But change should never come at the expense of the public interest. Instead of taking a sledgehammer to the main studio rule, the FCC majority could have exacted a more measured approach, such as a revised waiver process that considers market size and economic hardship. In fact, one commenter made this suggestion in the record, and my office proposed this as an alternative approach. Regrettably, the targeted proposal, which would have appropriately recognized that some stations in smaller markets face unique challenges to remaining on the air, was rejected by the chairman's office, and here we are. Similarly, the commission could have conditioned elimination of the rule on the station's commitment to directly use any cost savings to invest in services that are beneficial to consumers, including expanding local programming and improving news gathering in the nation's community of license. The NPRM, in fact, suggests that the savings could be used for such purposes, so why not tie the two together? Once again, my proposal was rejected, and here we are. While I do appreciate that stations continue to maintain a toll-free or local number that is staffed during normal business hours, I fear this does not go far enough to remedy the harms remedy the harms to communities that will no longer have a physical presence of their very own. So having proposed and repeatedly being vetoed on what I believe to be reasonable alternatives, I am left with no other choice than to dissent. While I strongly disagree with this order, nonetheless, I thank the Media Bureau staff for the dedicated public service and the passion they have for the public airwaves.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With this item, the Commission eliminates an unnecessary requirement that has long outlived its usefulness. The main studio rule, adopted in 1939, restricts broadcasters from allocating their resources efficiently and could even discourage them from launching stations in rural areas. This is a clear example of a Commission rule where the costs outweigh any perceived benefit, and I'm pleased that we're bringing this proceeding to a decisive conclusion. When it was implemented nearly 80 years ago, this rule may have made sense. There was no internet, social media, or even wireless phones, tools that we now rely on to connect quicker, easier, and more frequently with one another. Today, as the item recognizes, it is more efficient and effective to call or email a broadcast station, especially in times of emergency, rather than to visit the actual studio. By eliminating this requirement that a broadcast station must retain a physical location with a de facto requirement that we have 2 designated staff members, but retaining the obligation that broadcasters maintain a contact number, the Commission ensures that community members will be able to reach their local broadcaster in a way that reflects how the public currently communicates with local businesses. Importantly, this item eliminates costly burdens that no longer make sense in today's modern world. It does not eliminate localism, especially in local markets. The obligation to air programming responsive to the interests of the community and requirement to maintain in a broadcast station's public file the quarterly issues program list detailing the programs aired that provided the station's most significant treatment of community issues remain intact. There has been no causal effect, much less any correlation shown between the maintenance of this rule and the quality of programming or the amount of local content. Moreover, market incentives and license obligations will ensure that broadcasters remain focused on serving the needs of their local listeners and viewers. Broadcasters noted in the record that a significant number of broadcasters would continue to provide local program origination as a matter of prudent business operations in order to serve their communities and receive the economic support of same through advertising sales. In fact, removing this burden could actually pave the way for even more local content, especially in rural communities. Well, before, a station may decide not to locate in an area because it could not support the requirements embedded in the local in the main studio rule. Today the decision could be to expand rule coverage. I look forward to seeing how the market will evolve once the Commissioner removes an obsolete burden. Again, I thank the Chairman for focusing on this proposal, and it has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. A few months before the start of World War II, the Commission adopted the main studio rule that we take up today. In the decades that followed, the Commission relied on this rule to ensure that broadcast stations could stay connected with the local communities that they served. In today's digital age, however, a brick-and-mortar studio is no longer needed to achieve that goal. Technological innovations now provide stations with far more efficient and effective ways to interact with their local communities than in-person visits to a studio. These include social media pages, mobile apps, website comments, not to mention emails and phone calls. Not only is the main studio rule unnecessary, but the record shows that it actually hurts the ability of smaller stations, including those serving rural areas, from competing in today's media marketplace. In light of modern technology, broadcasters don't need a main studio to provide programming that responds to the needs of the local community. The Commission already made this finding when it relaxed the main studio rule back in 1987, and evidence in the 30 years since then simply confirm it. Indeed, the regulatory relief the FCC provides today could translate into tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in savings, particularly for smaller and rural broadcasters. A case in point is the owner of several radio stations in rural Texas. This broadcaster spends nearly $40,000 a year to maintain main studios in communities of only 900 and 1,800 residents, respectively. If the rule were repealed, the general manager says that he will be able to divert those savings towards hiring an additional reporter to cover local news and sports. The substantial yet unnecessary burdens associated with the main studio requirement have led a wide range of parties, from minority-owned and foreign language stations to broadcasters of all sizes, to call for the FCC to repeal the now outdated rule. I agree. I'm glad that the FCC is moving forward and taking this step. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
It was pitch black dark in Minot, North Dakota on January 18th, 2002. It was also bitter cold when at 1:37 a.m. a train derailed, slammed into a house, and sent a vast white cloud of anhydrous ammonia over the state's fourth largest city. If you lived nearby, you knew instantly things were not right. It was like something just grabbed your lungs, said a Minot resident who lived only 500 feet from the tracks. Then the electricity went out. So residents turned to battery-powered radios, the kind we are all told to keep on hand for a disaster. But when they tuned into their local stations, all they heard was canned music and DJ banter piped in from somewhere far, far away. Local radio failed the Minot community that night. It offered content that was anything but what residents needed to know. And there are many reasons, apologies, and arguments about why it happened this way. But one thing is clear. When broadcasters have a physical presence in the communities they serve, this is much less likely to happen. Of course, what happened in Minot took place more than a decade and a half ago. But a month and a half ago, I received an email from an individual in Beaumont, Texas. He described Hurricane Harvey in harrowing detail. Rain fell from the skies and flooded the roads, turning them into virtual lakes. There were widespread power failures, and some tried to flee the area. Others stayed put and attempted to rescue those who were caught in deep water. But as he writes, at midnight, during the peak of the storm, not one single station in this market had live coverage of the storm. Instead, he found his favorite stations broadcasting top 40 formats and national talk programs, oblivious to the trouble in the very community they purport to serve. There are, of course, many broadcasters who do an extraordinary job serving communities during disaster. But let's be honest, they can only do so when they have a very real presence in their area of license. That's not some retrograde notion, it's just a fact. I do not believe that wiping out the main studio rule is going to solve problems like the ones we saw in Minot and Beaumont. I do not believe that it will lead to better community coverage. I do not believe it will lead to more jobs. I do believe it will hollow out the unique role broadcasters play in local communities, a role that is not just tradition, but is an essential part of broadcasting under the Communications Act. I know that many stations face real economic challenges, and I wish we could have agreed to simple waivers for the main studio rule. Anytime it would allow small and mid-sized stations to keep the lights on and continue to offer service to their communities of license. I regret we do not take those steps here and instead strip our rules of the very localism that makes broadcasting unique. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Back in May, when we released the notice in this proceeding, I observed that broadcast stations and the purposes they serve have changed a lot since 1920, when the first commercial radio broadcast took place, and since 1939, when the FCC first adopted main studio requirements. That is why the FCC proposed to eliminate the main studio rule. The overwhelming majority of public input favored our proposal. Consider this statement from a comment. While the principle of localism remains as vital as ever, a regulatory obligation to maintain a main studio rule in any given place is no longer needed to preserve localism. Which radical corporatist partisan outfit said this? National Public Radio. NPR continued, the main studio rule forces public radio stations to allocate scarce resources to satisfy the rule, regardless of the information and programming needs and interests of a station's community of license. Now, the record more generally shows that main studios are no longer needed to enable broadcasters to be responsive to those communities of license. That is because the public these days is much more likely to interact with stations, including accessing stations' public files when they go online. Additionally, technology allows broadcast stations to produce local news even without a nearby studio. The record also shows that getting rid of the rule will help broadcasters serve viewers and listeners, especially those in small towns and rural areas where the cost of compliance dissuades broadcasters from even launching stations. One commenter, for example, stated that after FM Auction 94, it decided not to construct stations in South Dakota and Montana because of the costs associated with the main studio rule. The record further demonstrates that eliminating this rule will enable broadcasters to focus more resources on local programming and news gathering and community outreach, equipment upgrades, and attracting talent, all of which will better serve their communities. Given these facts, continuing to require a main studio would detract from, rather than promote, a broadcaster's ability and incentive to keep people informed and to serve the public interest. So thank you to Michelle Carey, to Martha Heller, and Diana Sokolow from the Media Bureau, and Raylan Remy, and to David Consul from the Office of General Counsel for your work on this order. We will proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Nay.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the work. And Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the seventh and final item on your agenda today will also be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Amendment of Section 73.624G of the Commission's rules regarding submission of FCC Form 2100, Schedule G, used to report TV stations' ancillary or supplementary services. Amendment of Section 73.3580 of the Commission's rules regarding public notice of the filing of broadcast applications, modernization of media regulation initiative, and revision of the public notice requirements of Section 73.3580. And once again, Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, go ahead.
The next item the Media Bureau presents is a notice of proposed rulemaking to update rules relating to the broadcaster's provision of ancillary and supplementary services and their obligation to notify the public about broadcast applications. The Commission adopted the rules governing ancillary or supplementary services almost 2 decades ago, when broadcasters were just beginning to transition from analog to digital format. And the Commission adopted the rules requiring public notice of broadcast applications more than half a century ago. As part of our media modernization initiative, the item before you proposes reforms that would eliminate or reduce these regulatory burdens. Martha Heller has joined me at the table, and Raylan Remy will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes changes to Section 73.624G2 of our rules that would relieve certain television broadcasters of an annual reporting obligation relating to the provision of so-called ancillary or supplementary services. These are services that broadcasters are able to offer as a result of the digital transition, separate and apart from their free over-the-air television service. Under the Communications Act, the Commission is required to collect fees from digital broadcasters that have received revenue from their provision of ancillary or supplementary services, and to report to Congress annually on those fees. To that end, the Commission adopted rules requiring digital television broadcasters to file annual reports about the provision of ancillary or supplementary services. However, the Commission required all digital television broadcasters to file the forms, even if they had offered no such services and were required to pay no fees. The notice proposes to reduce regulatory burdens by changing those rules so that only broadcasters that have provided feeable ancillary or supplementary services would be required to file those reports annually. We also seek comment on whether to update or repeal Section 73.3580 of our rules, which requires broadcast applicants to notify the public about the filing of broadcast license applications. To the extent this rule remains necessary, we seek comment on whether to allow applicants that currently must provide notice in a local newspaper, instead to have the option of providing that notice on an internet website. In cases where an applicant is required to broadcast specific announcements about the filing of a broadcast application, we seek comment on whether to give the applicant the option of referring the public to an internet website that contains the text of those announcements. These changes would give license applicants more flexibility in how they notify the public of broadcast applications, while preserving the public's ability to participate fully in the broadcast licensing process. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Remy. We'll now turn to Commissioner Clyburn for comments.
Today, for me, we're faced with a simple question. Do we proceed down a path to eliminate or relax a broadcaster's responsibility to notify the public when it files various license applications? My answer, likewise, is a simple one. Doing so is a horrible idea with no discernible benefit to consumers. So one might ask, why am I taking such a strong stand about making the public aware over multiple platforms of information that some may view as trivial? For one thing, how can this commission claim that it is able to determine whether a station is operating in the public interest, convenience, and necessity without key input from the viewing public? Permitting notification or quote-unquote referring the public to an internet website that contains the text of such announcements would signal to the American people that when it comes to a broadcaster's license application, it is simply move along, nothing here to see, or that it is okay to keep the digitally unconnected in the dark. Quite honestly, the very notion that the public's first instinct is to check the station's website to find out if they have filed a license application, that's absurd. Even more ridiculous is the suggestion that members of the public can sign up to receive commission-generated RSS feeds to alert them of such a filing. These alternatives sound like Washington geek speak, and is another example of why government officials are repeatedly accused of being out of touch with mainstream America. It seems sometimes that this commission forgets that these are the public airwaves, and that comes with a series of obligations on broadcasters, including to serve and be responsive to the local needs and interests of their community. It is already disheartening that the Commission does not have a more robust license renewal process in the first place to ensure that a station is truly meeting its obligations to the community, making it more difficult for viewers to know when their local station's license is up for renewal or is changing hands to a new station owner is a disservice to the viewing public. We need greater transparency, not less, among those given the responsibility to utilize the public airwaves. While I initially approached this NPRM ready to dissent, I am grateful to Commissioner Riley for hearing my concerns and working with my office to address the tone of the item and the need to ask whether there is a comparable means to notify the public if not done through on-air announcements. And although I continue to believe this NPRM is just another example of a deregulatory fishing expedition with less than transparent bait on the line because of the tonal changes made, I will vote to improve in part and concur in part so that a robust record can be built. My thanks to the Media Bureau staff for your work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A deregulatory fishing expedition. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
When the commission when the commission's modernization initiative launched in May, I had high expectations that it could quickly generate results, eliminating burdensome commission requirements that no longer serve the public interest. This item does just that. I'm also pleased to see that two outdated regulations the Commission will address today are issues I originally raised when the modernization initiative first circulated. The elimination of the FCC form submissions relating to ancillary and supplementary digital television incomes for parties that do not owe a fee, and updates to the public notice requirements for certain broadcast applications. First, the item addresses the requirement that nearly all television stations to file a form regarding a 5% DTV ancillary fee. As I've noted before, the report must be filed even if the answer is simply no fee due. To put this in perspective, in 2016, of the more than 6,600 broadcasters who were required to file this form, the Media Bureau identified less than 15 stations that reported receiving revenue from their ancillary or supplemental service last year. I stated in May that this form can and should be eliminated for parties that do not owe a fee, and I'm pleased to see that this rulemaking tentatively concludes just that. Second, the item examines the requirement for broadcasters to give public notice of certain applications in local newspapers. The item highlights that these requirements were adopted over half a century ago, and that today there are many more other ways the public can obtain this information, including in a broadcaster's public inspection file or through standard notices provided by the Commission. For these reasons, I support the full elimination of this reporting requirement. The item today also contemplates that if the public notice is maintained for some reason, whether to permit referral to an internet website or to provide via on-air broadcast. Well, I would prefer full elimination. If we do update the public notice requirement, we should do so in a manner that is flexible as possible. It took us over half a century to update this once. How much time will go by before we take another look? Finally, the item raises other provisions in Part 73 of the rules with public notice requirements that also appear outdated. The Commission seeks comment on whether to revise these rules, and I absolutely support such an endeavor. I thank the Chairman for his leadership on this issue and support the item and look forward to additional work in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Riley. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. On October 5th, 1962, the Commission amended its public notice requirements for broadcasters. For the historical pop culture enthusiasts that are here today, that date is probably better known as the day the Beatles released their first single and the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, premiered. While those two are now classics, the FCC's public notice rules have not aged as well. The days of requiring broadcasters to publish a notice in a local newspaper or make an on-air announcement about the application they filed with the Commission should be long gone in light of a lot of the technological advancements that we've seen. These types of requirements simply don't make sense in the digital age. So I'm pleased that we're seeking comment on whether to allow broadcasters to post these notices online or whether to eliminate them entirely. In today's notice, we also propose to reduce reporting obligations for digital broadcasters. Congress directs us to assess fees on the revenues these broadcasters generate from providing certain ancillary or supplemental services. But instead of collecting information from the few stations that actually have such revenues, that's less than 15 stations at last count, the Commission currently requires all DTV stations to file an annual form. In other words, we've been forcing thousands of licensees to spend time and money each year to tell us that they didn't make any money from providing these services. We should eliminate these kinds of pointless paperwork burdens. I therefore support the proposal to require only those broadcasters with reportable revenues to file this form. I hope that we will move quickly to adopt this common sense proposal. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Well, again, I don't have the Beatles or Dr. No online on my mind right now. I just have lunch. And in light of that, I will say that I appreciate the effort that the Bureau put into this rulemaking. I look forward to the comment that comes. It has my support.
Great. The important task of modernizing our media regulations proceeds apace. Here, we agree to take a hard look at two broadcast rules to determine whether to modify or eliminate them consistent with the public interest. The first involves broadcasters' obligations to file annual reports regarding their provision of ancillary or supplementary services. Now, this obligation makes sense for broadcasters that actually provide such services and thus have relevant fees to report. The delightful word feeable, which, as far as I can tell, is only used in the FCC world. But for the countless broadcasters that don't provide these services, filing the functional equivalent of blank reports with the FCC each and every year makes little sense and is unnecessarily burdensome. The second relates to our public notice requirements for broadcast applications. Beginning 5 decades ago and continuing until today, we have often required notice of these applications to be published in legacy media. But in 2017, Americans access and consume information in dramatically different ways. Google it if you don't believe me. We hope that the public will tell us whether we should update these requirements to match the modern age or, alternatively, whether we should repeal them. Like my colleagues, I want to thank the staff of the Media Bureau and the Office of General Counsel for the hard work on this notice. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
Approve and concur in part.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
Chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. That concludes the substantive items on today's agenda. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time?
Everyone?
Oh, sorry. You can Rochambeau for it.
Sure. So 2 announcements from my office. First, I want to announce Jamie Suskind. She's agreed to return to the FCC and join my office as Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor for wireline issues. Jamie has extensive experience on wireline and broadband deployment matters, and she also brings a deep policy expertise to the job, as demonstrated by her time as a staffer in the U.S. Senate. She served most recently as Chief Counsel to Senator Deb Fischer, and previously she was a staffer on the Senate Commerce Committee as well, so thank you for joining the office. The second announcement, if I can find it, is to announce that Dreama Johnson has joined my office as confidential assistant. Dreama has worked at the agency for over a dozen years, serving initially as the confidential assistant for then Chairman Kennard, before eventually moving on to bigger and better things in the office of Commissioner Clyburn. So I'm glad that she's agreed to downgrade and joining my office. She's really known and respected by every member of the bar, everyone that does business with the Commission, for her professionalism, and so I'm glad that she's agreed to take this job. Thank you.
Commissioner Clyburn?
And Brendan, I wanted to co-sign. I want to welcome you. I think I've done that already, but to say officially goodbye to Dreama Johnson. I don't think it really hit me until they fired Dusty Baker, and I'm like, who in this office can I complain to about what I think is such a disservice and injustice to sports humanity. But anyway, I want to say that, Dreama, you have been a godsend for this office. You have looked out for me when I didn't want to be looked out for. I want to thank you for that and more. Now, you're going to know every weather prognostication, and, I just want to warn you, sports, and you're going to get all of that, but what you also get is a person who will watch your back. So congratulations to you. Goodbye goodbye, not farewell, to
She's
Dreama.
not moving to Montana.
Well, almost. But again, I will want to thank, her for her years of service and dedication to this agency.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Rosenworcel or Riley?
You can go ahead.
I'll go next. I wanted to take a moment to welcome and introduce to my office Brooke Erickson, who's my new Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor on Media Issues. Brooke comes to our office from a prominent role in Senator Ron Johnson's office and has been involved in communications policy for quite a while and is known as an all-star policy expert throughout Capitol Hill. And I'm incredibly lucky to have her join our office and our team. I know the FCC is already the FCC family has already welcomed her, and I trust that everyone will enjoy working with her in the near future. So welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Well, I have thoughts on Dusty Baker, too.
And
it's not been fun telling my Little League kids.
Yeah, you do well, and you get fired. Okay.
Oh, all right. So let's talk about some happy news. I mentioned Travis Lippman rejoining my office last month, but I have not had the opportunity to introduce Kate Black, who joins my office from Emily's List, and she will be working on media issues. At Emily's List, she was responsible for a lot of things. This included the management of the Run to Win program, which was developed to recruit, train, and elect as many as 18,000 women to public office. She also served as the Vice President of Research at Emily's List, where she specialized in regulatory issues affecting families and the economy. In addition, she served as Executive Director of American Women, where she led the organization's polling, messaging, and policy development with a special focus on media consumption and the impact of new technologies. She's also held a variety of other positions at the Democratic National Committee, at the Service Employees International Union, and Hillary Clinton for President. And this is my favorite part. She is the co-author with June Diane Raphael of Represent, the Badass Woman's Guide to Running for Office and Changing the World. It's going to be published next year, so watch out.
Do you have something to announce?
I just love that title.
Oh, yeah.
I just love that title.
She
is a dynamo, and she is going to be not just terrific in my office, but an asset to this commission. I also want to thank Holly Sauer, who's sitting next to her. Holly has helped me more times than I have the ability to count. And this time she came up to help me get J-Road 2.0 up and running. She was the first there. She is someone with encyclopedic knowledge of media issues. She has an uncommon grace dealing with the advocates who come before this agency. And she has an unbelievable ability to navigate the regulatory minutia at this agency. And she has helped me do all of that in the 2+ months that she has been in my office. I am so grateful for the time that she has spent with me, but I'm even more grateful to be able to call her a friend. So thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome to Kate, to Brooke, to Jamie. Hello and goodbye to Dreama. And I have a few announcements of my own. First, you might notice a change at the table. We have a new general counsel. So I want to welcome Tom Johnson to the hot seat. Tom comes to us as the Deputy Solicitor General for the state of West Virginia, where he served under Attorney General Patrick Morrissey. He went to Georgetown for his undergraduate degree. He went to Harvard Law School for his law degree in the tried and true footsteps of Justice Scalia. Unlike Justice Scalia, however, he clerked for Judge Jerry Smith on the Fifth Circuit, and then he worked at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where he was an able trial and appellate litigator. We are grateful to him for serving at the Commission in this important role at this important time, and I look forward to his leadership of the office and providing counsel to all the commissioners and to the bureaus and offices at the Commission. With his arrival means that we have a departure. Nick Degani, who was the acting general counsel, will return to the chairman's office. We welcome his cackle and his counsel, hopefully not in that order, back to the office, and are grateful to him for all the work that he does.
He must not be here. I don't hear him.
Yeah, you would hear him if he were around. So he's somewhere up on the 8th floor, I think. He's prowling around, guffawing.
Wait a minute.
I also want to make a couple of announcements with respect to FCC staff who have just done extraordinary things. Last week, Bill Hurst, who is here in the front row next to Julie, Bill is the chief of the FCC Labs Technical Research Branch, and he was awarded the American National Standard Association's Gerald H. Ritterbusch Conformity Assessment Medal. Now, contrary to what you may have heard, this award is not given to the person who most shamelessly fits in. Conformity assessment means that Bill was recognized for his distinguished service in promoting the understanding and application of conformity assessment methods as a means of providing confidence in the standards compliance that we have in the marketplace. Through his work at the FCC and with the IEEE and other international standards organizations, Bill has set the standard when it comes to fostering successful public-private partnerships. He's represented the Commission and the United States generally on many international trade matters and agreements with the European Union, Japan, Canada, Mexico, Israel, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, and the Inter-American Commission for Telecommunications, or CTEL. He's currently deeply engaged in the U.S. delegation's discussions with Canada and Mexico with respect to revising NAFTA. And in 2016, he was the recipient of the FCC's Catherine Forster Public Service Award. Bill, could you please stand up so we could recognize you with a round of applause? Congratulations. And Roxanne McElvain-Weber, I don't know if she's here. She's okay. Well, last week at the World Telecommunication Development Conference, or the WTDC in Buenos Aires, some pretty rough duty, I will tell you. Roxanne from the International Bureau was appointed to serve as the chairperson of the ITU Development Sector's Advisory Group, or TDAG. I just love these acronyms. Now, the TDAG in the ITU sector, development sector, reviews the priorities, strategies, operations, and financial matters of the ITUD. Roxanne has been a leader in the ITU development sector for over 2 decades, and her appointment reflects the valuable contributions that she has made on behalf of the FCC, of course, and the United States government generally in the international community. Roxanne, wherever you are, we are grateful for your service on the international stage, and thanks to International Bureau Chief Tom Sullivan for his leadership and encouraging Roxanne's efforts and the entire International Bureau's efforts in this regard. If there are no further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next date of the Commission's agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, November 16th, 2017.
Happy Halloween, and we stand adjourned.
Outside, we're ready to get started with the press conference. Chairman Pai, when you're ready.
All right, first and foremost, happy 21st birthday to Ted Johnson. You only turn 21 once, make it count, my friend. So, I know that, on a serious note, that many of you have come here today to ask me questions about a topic that a lot of folks have been discussing recently. Obviously, there's a lot of passion on both sides of this issue, so I just want to address it up front. I will have no comment on the announcement that Justin Timberlake will be performing at the Super Bowl show, at the halftime show. And for those of you who don't like this response, I offer a quote from Mr. Timberlake himself, "Cry me a river." But on a more serious note, October 24th is not just any ordinary day for U.S. communications. On October 24th, 1861, the Western Union completed construction on the first transcontinental telegraph. Over 27,000 poles and 2,000 miles of iron wire connected Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. Now, last week, 156 years after this milestone and more than a decade after Western Union sent its last telegram in the United States, our telegraph rules were scrapped from the Code of Federal Regulations. 2 points to this story. One, now you see what I'm talking about when I said that the FCC's regulatory underbrush needs to be cleared out. And two, this is just the latest evidence that the FCC is matching its words with action when it comes to removing outdated and unnecessary rules. And we build on that progress yet again today. Most notably, we just voted to remove the main studio rule, which was established in 1939 and still imposes significant costs on broadcasters. Striking this regulation will make it easier for new broadcast stations to operate in small towns and rural communities. This is good news for broadcasters and, more important, good news for the public. I also think it's worth noting that the main studio item was one of 4 orders on the agenda. And it's gratifying to see that multiple rulemakings that were launched earlier this year, mostly in the spring, have now been completed. And it shows yet again that the Commission staff continues to do an outstanding job of processing comments in the record and then bringing the Commission to a final conclusion. Obviously, there were many other items approved by the Commission just now, but it's already been a long day, and none of them are tied to any particular pop culture or historical events. And so I will just move straight to your questions, such as you might have them.
Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Chairman, President Trump has tweeted about how long he's going to be in Puerto Rico, or at least the aid will be in Puerto Rico. How long is the FCC going to be in Puerto Rico? Is there an end date for that? Is it tied to what the president wants or to what FEMA is doing, or how does that work?
There is no particular end date for the FCC's, you said presence in Puerto Rico? There's no particular end date to our presence in Puerto Rico. We are working collaboratively with FEMA to see what assistance they might need in terms of getting communications networks up and running, in doing radio frequency spectrum analysis and other communications-related tasks. And obviously, even without a physical presence there, our efforts are going to continue well into the future, I would imagine. We've already issued a number of waivers, special temporary authorizations, or STAs. I've personally been on the phone, as I mentioned before, with the FEMA administrator, with wireless carriers, with tower companies, with Puerto Rican officials and others to see what the FCC can do to help. So one way or the other, I think the FCC is going to be in the mix, so to speak, for some time.
Thanks. Kyle Daly, Bloomberg BNA. So a few weeks before President Trump's fateful tweets, you called calls for broadcast licenses over content fundamentally at odds with America's cultural and legal traditions. I guess just why not offer a similarly direct and immediate refutation when it's the most powerful person in the country making those same calls?
Well, I'm going to state my own views in my own words, and I'm not going to characterize the comments of others. And what I said a month ago and what I said last week remains true, that I believe in the First Amendment, that the FCC under my leadership will stand for the First Amendment, and under the law, the FCC will act according to law. And we cannot revoke broadcast licenses based on the content of a particular newscast.
Have you heard anything from the White House on that front beyond the tweets?
No.
John? Hi, John Hendel, Politico. Just wanted to ask a little bit about the broadband deployment, Section 706 NOI. Just given there have been comments coming in on that, and wonder if you had any comment on some of the reactions so far, given you've had some folks such as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and others kind of push back a little bit on that, and didn't know if you thought any of that had been kind of misunderstood, or just kind of how you viewed some of the response there, given it was quite strong from the Hill and elsewhere.
Well, look, the record is still developing, so we haven't reached any conclusions yet. I'll simply say that the lead proposal is to maintain the 25.3 standard, and so political actors will always make statements about what they think is in an item or what the item is, what they think the item is proposing to do. But the text speaks for itself, and at the end of the day, we're going to make the appropriate judgment based on the facts and not on extraneous political considerations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah Cohen, CTFN.
Hello.
Hi. If the Commission has dissuaded merging parties in the past from merging to preserve 4 large players, what factors need to change for you to reconsider that merger, to make that merger more palatable? Is it just a change of commission, or
Are you speaking about a particular transaction? Look, unlike others in the past, I do not comment on transactions that have not yet been filed with the Commission, and so I can't offer any commentary about what the agency might do if any transaction were to be filed. Thanks. Hi.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Tara Jeffries, Bloomberg BNA. Just a general process question on mergers.
Okay.
You and Commissioner O'Reilly, under the Wheeler FCC, had spoken out in the past on doing major items at the bureau level rather than the commission level, I believe. How do you feel about just generally doing large mergers on delegated authority rather than at the 8th floor level?
Well, look, at the end of the day, you have to abide by the rules of the commission, and the rule says that if something is new or novel, I mean, I'm generalizing, there's a particular text of the rule, but the basic concept is that if something is new or novel, then the full commission has to weigh in. If it is not new or novel, then the chairman has the authority to delegate to a subordinate bureau or office. So the question is always, are we abiding by the rules or not? And there's also a tradition, as you might know, if a commissioner or two commissioners request that something be elevated to the full commission for consideration. Certainly, if two commissioners weighed in that vein, then by tradition the chairman would present it to the full commission for review. And that was something that was honored in the breach under the prior administration, and it's something that we are looking to reinstate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lynn Stanton, Tara Daly. At the beginning of your tenure, you started this pilot program. You call it a pilot program for circulating or making public the circulated items for meetings.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you still consider it a pilot? Is it now permanent? In terms of non-meeting items, when you circulate them, do you've got any vision for expanding the program to those kinds of items?
Yeah, that's a good question. It should just occur to me. We didn't formally declare the pilot over. I guess we're still technically in the air as far as it's going. But I think it's been a tremendous success. I have yet to hear anybody, I mean, other than people who are just going to oppose whatever it is that we do, who are complaining about the fact that they can actually see what the commission is doing before we do it. And most recently, I've had the chance to visit with some of my predecessors. So that's actually a really useful way to promote openness and transparency. We haven't yet had the chance to sit down and think about extending it to circulation items. That's something that I'd certainly be interested in discussing with my colleagues and working with the commission staff to determine the feasibility and benefits of doing so. But thus far, I think the pilot's been great. In fact, you know what? Why don't we just go ahead and declare the pilot over? It is now the official policy of the FCC for monthly meetings to release these at least 3 weeks in advance. And like I said, I think it's been a really good thing for the commission, and the public has seen it the same.
Thank you.
Chairman Pai, following up on Kyle's question, has anybody from the White House reached out to you or your staff about the president's tweets on broadcast licenses?
No.
And as you know, the president said network news has become so partisan, distorted, and fake that licenses must be challenged and, if appropriate, revoked. I know you have stayed away from commenting on his motivation, but do you think that poses a chilling effect on the First Amendment, or what message does that send to broadcasters?
Again, all I can say is what my views are and what my approach is to the FCC's work as an independent agency. And that view is very clear, and my record is very clear. Going back to the time when I first started as a commissioner, extending all the way until just last month and even last week when I made these comments about the First Amendment. So we're going to apply the facts and the law as we see them and make the appropriate decision.
Chairman Pai, Matt Wazalowski at WYAB in Jackson, Mississippi.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you. I think based on some of the things we've heard today already, Commissioner Carr would refer to me as a smaller rural broadcaster. Commissioner Clyburn would call me a struggling broadcaster. You had said that the commission will release one broadcast-related initiative in every open meeting from now until the foreseeable future. Is the FM Class C4 proposal part of that agenda, given the fact that you had supported the idea at the 2016 RAB-NAB radio show?
Great question. And first, welcome to the commission. I've been to Jackson, and I'm glad to see some Jacksonians.
Welcome anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be back. I had a chance to visit WLOO the last time I was down there, and got some good barbecues. So the C4 proposal was something that we had teed up separately from the Media Modernization Regulatory Initiative. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while, but I believe the staff is still looking at what the appropriate course of action is going forward on that. And so I'd refer you to the Media Bureau if you have particular questions about it, but my vague recollection, I've got a lot of stuff going on at the moment, is that we're still trying to decide the right way forward and see if there's a consensus there.
Well, I guess I'm Carl Haynes from Jackson, Mississippi, Chairman Pai. I guess my question kind of relates to his. In respect to this Class 4 policy issue, does this seem to be a engineering issue or a policy issue with the commission, or can you say which one it is?
Here too, if I remember correctly, and it's been a little while since I looked at the record and some staff analysis, but there was some division, I believe, both on the technical and the policy side, but I can't confirm that for sure. I'd have to refer you to our media bureau, who I think is here, as a matter of fact, if you have any questions about that.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Pai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple really hard-hitting questions about Justin Timberlake.
I'm not going to sing "Can't Stop That Feeling."
To follow up on both Dave and Kyle's question, I want to get a different thing, which is, why did it take you so long to respond to the president's comments? As you said, your record on this is longstanding. You were highly critical of Chairman Wheeler's relationship with the Obama White House. You've said multiple times that you're a staunch supporter of the First Amendment. In fact, it's on your bio on the website. So I'm wondering why you took so long and, in fact, only spoke out when you were in a position, frankly, where you sort of had to, right? You were in an event.
Well, look, I answered the first time I was personally asked about the issue. And at the end of the day, I'm leading an independent agency. And my record, as you pointed out, on these issues, both with respect to the First Amendment and agency independence, is very clear and extending all the way to last month. And at the end of the day, I understand that those who oppose my agenda would like me to be distracted by the controversy of the day. But I'm going to be focused on the work of the Commission and everything that we do, and that includes a respect for the First Amendment.
So you think that any complaints about your response to this were political in motivation?
Again, I understand that those who are opposed to our agenda would like me to be distracted by the controversies of the day, but I'm going to stay focused on our agenda here at the FCC.
So sorry, just one more. You view this as a distraction. Is that what you're saying?
Again, my comment speaks for itself.
Okay. Thank you.
Alan Otum with CQ Roll Call.
Hi.
About the FCC reauthorization. I had a follow-up to your testimony from July, and as I'm sure you recall that you made the point that it would give you, I think, sort of, not your words, but sort of a legislative fix as far as the private banks not being willing to, take the spectrum auction bidders' cash. And I was wondering if you could explain how that fix would work, and how did you handle it for the last spectrum auction then? Was that just held by the agency without gaining interest, or?
Right. So this is a very important provision of the FCC reauthorization legislation. And I guess zooming out to 60,000 feet, our goal at the end of the day is to be able to lead the world in terms of 5G and spectrum policy. Part of doing that involves being able to hold major spectrum auctions for spectrum they were seeking to get into the commercial marketplace. Part of holding spectrum auctions means that we have to have a place to deposit those funds. Part of having a place to deposit those funds, given current regulatory requirements, which have changed since the last time we held a major auction, is finding a financial institution that is willing and able to hold those funds. We have not been able, at this point, to find a private bank that is able to satisfy those regulatory requirements. And similarly, the Treasury, without this legislative fix, we are not able to transfer those funds to the Treasury. And so we're essentially, we've got money in our hands potentially, but we don't have anywhere to put it. And so that's why this legislative fix is so important, because it would allow those deposits, those upfront bidders' deposits to be sent to the Treasury. And that way we would have financial safeguards and compliance with other regulatory requirements that are necessary in order for those auctions to take place.
Just one follow-up on that. So
Sure.
for the funds from the last giant auction that we all read about, then how was that handled? Was that legislated so that it could be held or moved directly to the Treasury, or how did that? Do you know how that worked?
Previously, as I understand it, and the General Counsel's office or the Wireless Bureau can correct me, but there was no legislative or regulatory requirement for the FCC to hold these funds at a public institution. They were held in a private bank account, so that's where those funds for that incentive auction.
And so we earned interest on that money.
I believe
Apparently.
so, yes.
If any staff has anything on that, I'll take it by email. But thank you
Sure.
very much, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Margaret? Hi, Margaret Beal from Politico. My question is about the Trump tweet. One more on that. After your response, some said that they weren't satisfied with the answer, that you didn't go far enough. So I want to ask, will the FCC revoke a station license because the president is dissatisfied with news coverage?
At the end of the day, we are going to follow the law. And the law does not allow the FCC to revoke a broadcast license based on the content of a particular newscast.
Chairman, do you believe that when it comes to political ads, that online platforms should actually face the same disclosure requirements as broadcasters do? That is the current premise of legislation on Capitol Hill.
So I haven't had a chance to review that legislation. I know that this is a political issue that is of great interest on Capitol Hill, and that's something obviously that is within the province of legislators to decide. I haven't had a chance to study it closely enough to be able to weigh in on it at this point. Thank you.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, have a good day.
The first item was the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau on caller ID services. Are there questions on that item? Okay. The second, let's combine the. Let's see. The second one is the. Nationwide number portability. Are there questions on that item? Okay. 3 was the 3.5 gig item. Okay. The fourth one was the CGB on hearing aid compatibility. Are there questions on that one? Okay. Fifth was the International Bureau on reporting requirements. Finally, there's 2 Media Bureau items at the end, the main studio rule and the FCC Form 2100.
I got a quick one on main studio.
Okay. So Media Bureau, who is here from the Media Bureau? There's Michelle.
Hi, Michelle, Monty, Tom Daly. It didn't sound like much change from the draft version that came out, but I was wondering if we should expect some changes in there. Is there anything that was altered much from the draft?
Which item are you?
Oh, sorry, main studio. I should have said.
Well, I think you heard there's 2 dissents, so I think you can assume the item didn't change very much.
That was my bet. That's all I got.
That's it. Okay.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. I'm not, Commissioner Carr, are you? Okay, so there will be some commissioner press conferences as well, so hang in. Thank you. And after the chairman, everyone's gone.
Shocker. Well, if there's anyone that would like any questions answered by Commissioner Carr or myself, we're happy to make ourselves available. Oh, there's a hand.
Hey.
I will start. We'll just go this way, but.
Go with Kyle. I'm still cogitating.
Okay.
All right.
Cogitating. Nice.
I think I'm well cogitated. For Commissioner Carr, do you believe that the Commission has the authority to raise or in any way change the national ownership cap without an act of Congress?
Yeah, this was an issue that has been teed up in the FCC's proceedings so far. We looked at it a little bit in the context of the UHF discount proceeding, and comments are coming in on that issue right now, and we'll see how the agency proceeds on that issue.
So right now you haven't prejudged it. You're waiting for comments to come in.
No prejudgment. That is right.
I did cogitate some, and I have a question now. Commissioner O'Reilly, you just wrote a big blog post about how the commission should take action on a bunch of media ownership stuff. I was wondering what motivated you to write that blog post now. Do you have some reason to believe the commission isn't going to do that, or do you think it's going to happen soon, or?
I write things as they come up and when I think they're appropriate to address. I'm hopeful that they will address this issue soon. The chairman has indicated that he'd like to address them by the end of the year. He, of course, controls the schedule, so I don't want to get ahead of him. But I'm hopeful that we're in that time period. That'll be November or December kind of is the end of the time frame, and so I think it's appropriate timing for me to raise my viewpoints. Sure.
Commissioner Carr, I believe you're the only one of the commissioners who has not responded in any way publicly to the President's tweets and how the FCC should respond to them.
That is not correct, but okay.
Okay, well, I'm sorry.
This morning.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Could you reiterate, since I haven't seen that?
Sure, glad to. What I said this morning, there's a lot of questions that went to this when I went through the confirmation process back in June and July. My view is very clear, which I believe very passionately in the First Amendment. Every decision that I make at this commission is going to be consistent with the First Amendment. There's nothing that's changed in my position from when I was on the record in very detailed ways in June and July during the confirmation process.
Dave Shepherdson from Reuters. Let me ask you both about the net neutrality proceeding. It's widely believed among lobbyists and both pro and con on the subject that the commission will take up the proceeding at the December meeting, which would mean the white copy would be out just before Thanksgiving. Have either of you gotten any indication or seen any drafts from the chairman's office about what a rule might look like, or can you give us some sense of whether any decisions or pre-decisions have been made at this point?
I think the chairman's press conference was right before this one, which would be the right place to ask those. I don't have any insight in terms of timing.
I don't have any insight on timing or anything to that nature yet. We'll get to there when we get to there. We just finished one meeting and looking forward to the next.
But the chairman has not engaged the two of you yet to try to come to some sort of consensus about what the final rule should look like?
I've had no discussions with anybody about what the final rule should look like.
Commissioner O'Reilly, wanted to follow up on the 3.5 gigahertz.
Oh, sure.
So, as Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned in her dissent to that measure, she was referring to the sort of innovation experimental approach that the 2015 rules had, in her opinion, given. Do you agree that innovation is being stifled by the move today in the NPRM?
Absolutely not. I've highlighted, multiple times where I think the commission made mistakes in its previous decisions. I think that what's missing in this conversation is that the three legs of the stool, the GAA, protecting incumbents, and licensees, were supposed to all work. Well, part of the licensee, the PALs, were basically, under our current structure, excluded from a number of entities. That's not an efficient way. That's not an appropriate way to act. And so today we took the first step to correcting that error, in my opinion. So I don't agree with her analysis that it is infraction or a violation of innovation. We talked about this. This is the experiment ban or the innovation ban. We kind of labeled certain things. We're already throwing at this spectrum ban a number of issues, including trying to make all those things work, including making the ESCs work and the SASs and all these other things. I don't believe that we have a flawed auction structure before us, and therefore I don't think it was necessary to toss it overboard, and we're not missing innovation by adopting rules that have been very successful and are the envy of the world, in my opinion. Any questions from those over there in the...
I got a weird one.
Oh, yeah? Okay. That's a weird way to start it, right?
Yeah, I got a weird one. I've noticed that in recent meetings, more commissioners have declined to make statements on more items than I had ever seen before. Now, maybe that's just me, but is there a reason you guys are all doing that?
I don't want to speak for anyone else. I look at my statement. We work really hard on them, and then just determine whether it could be something that can be submitted for the record, and therefore you'll be able to read it, and we'll make it available. Or I'm trying to make a point. So like 3.5, I had an extended statement because I spent a considerable amount of time. Some of the items are a little smaller than others, and therefore I'm just trying to balance it out with respect to try and get people to lunch, trying to in response to all the different obligations that we have.
So there's
at the
no
Commission.
guidance to cut the statement shorter or anything like that.
No. I'm not aware of any guidance. I would just doing my own, trying to be courteous to my colleagues.
Well, you're not the only one that's been doing it, so I was wondering. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think I suggest to all my colleagues that they figure out how to make their statements and pick and choose what they would like to, just to out of courtesy. But that's certainly their full obligation and full right to do whatever they see appropriate.
That helps me out. I got nothing.
All right, last call. Any more questions before I walk out the door? Okay, thanks everyone.